Imagine this scene. A 1.5-year-old girl named Jenny hears her neighbor's baby cry. She looks startled and tense. She tries to comfort him by offering him cookies, but he won't take them. Then she tries to stroke his hair, but he pulls away. Then she brings her own mother over and puts her mother's hand on the baby's head. So in this scene, which comes from a study out of the National Institute of Mental Health, Jenny's response is very caring. She not only notices and reacts to the baby crying, she also works hard to try to help the baby feel better. Now, contrast Jenny's response with some of the saddest research I've ever read. Psychologists at Florida State University observed preschoolers in a daycare setting who had been physically abused. These children were more likely than their non-abused classmates to do things that upset other kids and to respond to peers' distress that they didn't cause by withdrawing, teasing, or hitting the crying child. So instead of offering comfort, physically abused children tended to either pull away or do things to make their upset peers feel worse. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how kids learn to care about others. We'll focus on empathy, which I define as an emotional resonance to another person's distress that motivates compassionate behavior. The most basic way to teach our children empathy is to give it. When we respond to our children's distress with sensitivity and kindness, we not only comfort them, we also show them how to comfort someone. And we help them learn that relationships involve giving and receiving comfort. In research with adults, just a subliminal reminder of the names of people who have cared for them makes people respond in more empathic ways toward others. Children who have received a lot of warm and responsive parenting are much better equipped to respond with empathy to other people's distress. I wish I could tell you that all you have to do is be kind and your child will learn to be empathic. But research and our own experience tells us that it's all too common for children to behave in uncaring ways, even kids who haven't been abused. Kids can be very mean. Learning to care is hard work. It's also important work. Empathy is the bedrock of close relationships and a key force behind compassionate behavior. As parents, there's a lot we can do to help our children develop empathy. Empathy is a complicated concept that involves 3 interwoven strands of internal experience: affective resonance, perspective taking, and motivation for compassionate prosocial behavior. Let's take a look at each of these. Affective resonance is the first and most basic strand of empathy. Observing another person's emotional response tends to trigger secondhand emotional reactions. We wince involuntarily when we see someone bang her thumb with a hammer. There's no deliberate thought going on here. This is a pre-verbal, automatic reaction. Even babies who are only a few days old tend to cry when they hear another baby crying. But they don't cry when they hear a recording of their own crying, so this isn't just a response to noise. During normal conversations, both adults and children very quickly and without even realizing it mimic the facial expressions, vocal frequency, and posture of their conversation partners in very subtle ways. If we spend time with someone who's feeling discouraged or irritable or excited, we tend to start behaving and feeling the same way. But affective resonance is more than muscle deep. People tend to synchronize not only their behavioral signs of emotion, but also their physiological responses. In one study, researchers caused moms to feel stress by making them give an impromptu speech in front of 2 frowning judges. Then, when they reunited the moms with their 1-year-old children, the children's heart rates increased to match their mom's heart rates, even though the children hadn't been exposed to the stressful situation. What causes this affective resonance across people? It may be due to what's called the mirror neuron system. our brains seem to echo other people's emotions. Functional MRI studies show that we have similar patterns of brain activity when we experience an emotion ourselves and when we witness someone else experiencing the emotion. We can even pick up on other people's emotions through smell. Researchers led by an investigator at Stony Brook University collected sweat from people who were either exercising on a treadmill or feeling very stressed because they were skydiving for the first time. They then had study participants sniff the two kinds of sweat. How do researchers come up with this stuff anyway? Even though people couldn't tell the two types of sweat apart by smell, their brains reacted to alarm pheromones in the stress sweat by showing greater activation in regions associated with fear. So we seem to be hardwired to pick up on other people's emotions in various ways. But affective resonance doesn't necessarily lead to kind behavior. Nancy Eisenberg at Arizona State University and her colleagues find that if young children's affective resonance is too intense, it can slip into personal distress. When this happens, children's faces look tense, their heart rates increase, and they're less likely to help other people because they're focused on their own suffering. Kids who have strong emotional reactions and poor emotion regulation skills are more likely to respond this way. On the other hand, less intense affective resonance can lead to empathic concern. In this case, children's faces look sad, their heart rates decelerate, and they're more likely to try to make the other person feel better. So the implication here for parents is that soothing our children and helping them learn how to manage their own emotions isn't just a nice thing to do. It also builds a foundation for empathy. When kids aren't overwhelmed by their own feelings, they have room emotionally to care about others. Now, in humans, there's more to empathy than passively catching someone else's feelings. The second strand of empathy is perspective taking, which involves being able to imagine how someone else feels. Perspective taking is a skill that children develop only gradually over many years. 6 to 12-month-old babies tend to react to other people's distress by seeking comfort for themselves. When a 1-year-old sees her friend scrape her knee, she might start crying and reach for her dad because she doesn't have the perspective-taking ability to recognize that it was the friend who got hurt, not her. Between 1 and 2 years of age, children sometimes try to help others when they're distressed, but they tend to comfort others the way they like to be comforted. So a toddler who sees his mother looking sad might bring her his teddy bear. By 3 years, kids are better at responding in ways that the other person would find helpful. Perspective-taking skills continue to grow throughout childhood. 4-year-olds can answer questions like, "What makes mommy feel sad?" 5-year-olds can imagine the emotions of characters in vignettes involving familiar events. 8-year-olds grasp that people can have different feelings in the same situation. Tweens can imagine the feelings of people and circumstances they haven't encountered. Adolescents can understand other people's ambivalence and infer feelings that people are trying hard to hide. What this means for parents is that an important way to help our children develop empathy is to give them lots and lots of practice with perspective taking. We can do this by talking about feelings with our children as they come up in books or movies or daily life. With preschoolers, talking about feelings mostly involves naming and explaining. You can say things like, "He feels sad because his friend is away." With older kids, you can ask questions like, "How do you think he felt about that when it happened?" Or, "Why do you think she did that?" But don't be annoying and overdo this. You just want to help your child cultivate an awareness and curiosity about people's inner lives. Unfortunately, just knowing intellectually how someone would feel is not enough for empathy. Perspective taking that's not connected to caring feelings can lead to indifference or even contribute to strategic cruelty. Bullies and sociopaths are very good at perspective taking, but they use this skill to cause suffering and even enjoy their victim's pain. For genuine empathy, we need a third ingredient, which is compassionate motivation, the desire to respond in caring ways to someone in distress. Research finds that in general, as children get older, they become more likely to comfort, share with, or help others. One study found that 14-month-old children responded kindly to people in distress less than 1/10 of the time. But 2-year-olds responded compassionately almost half the time. Latent selfishness is more common among preschoolers than elementary-age children. In experimental studies, 16-year-olds are more likely than younger teens to donate resources or help others in distress. Now, if you're like me, you'll hear these findings and want to ask the researchers, have you spent any time lately among families with children? Because this is what parents typically see in terms of compassionate motivation. The little ones, toddlers and preschoolers, are eager and delighted to help. The big kids, older elementary school and teenagers, who are much more capable of helping, if you ask them to do a simple task like emptying the dishwasher, they moan, "Why do I have to do it?" When my son was about 17 years old, my husband and I had a conversation with him, one of many, about the importance of pitching in. And he responded, "What? I help. One time, a few months ago, when we were having people over, I went to the grocery store and got grapes for you." Now, just to put this comment in context, this was when he was in that human locust stage that teenage boys often go through, where they come into the house and eat everything that isn't nailed down. So I was doing a large grocery shop at least 3 times a week just to keep him fed. So we were underwhelmed by his contribution to the family in buying grapes once, a few months ago. And yet, around that same time, my son was extraordinarily kind and supportive toward a friend of his who was dealing with some pretty serious mental health issues. So clearly he was capable of wonderful empathy. He just wasn't applying it much at home. This is a fairly common dynamic in families with teens. Teenagers' eyes are focused outside the family, so they work on forging their independent identity while also defending against their wish to be taken care of by parents, like a little kid. Teenagers' obliviousness to their parents' feelings can range from annoying to viciously hurtful. The best advice I can give for this stage is be patient and try to take the high road. Don't attack back. Try to respect your teen's need for autonomy while also encouraging at least some degree of civility and cooperation at home. Odds are, with time, your teen will come around again to kindness. Compassionate motivation doesn't flow automatically from affective resonance and perspective taking. These first 2 strands of empathy can alert us to others' needs, but then we consider whether or not we want to help. We ask ourselves, does this person deserve my help and concern? Even very young children are less likely to help people who they've seen be mean to someone else. We also ask ourselves, am I capable of helping? Is there someone else available who's more qualified to help? And what would it cost me to help? If we don't see it as our job to step in, if it would be very difficult to help, or if we benefit somehow from that person's suffering, we're less motivated to respond in caring ways. For parents, an indirect but very powerful way to help our children develop compassionate motivation is to support their friendships. If a friend isn't having fun, she'll take her ball and go home. So to maintain a friendship, children need to learn to recognize and respond warmly to their friends' feelings. Caring about a friend, or even just wanting to play with that friend, can help children rein in selfish impulses and marshal caring responses. So far, we've talked about the 3 interwoven strands of empathy: affective resonance, cognitive perspective taking, and motivation for compassionate behavior. We've highlighted ways that parents can support each of these. I want to talk now about 3 more general ways of helping children develop empathy. These involve challenging empathy exceptions, giving kids a path forward when they behave in unkind ways, and supporting their identity as a caring person. It's all too easy for kids to decide that certain people don't count as deserving of empathy. Sometimes it's that weird kid in school. Sometimes it's a child of a different race, religion, or economic class. So a very important part of teaching children empathy is to challenge their empathy exceptions. In general, we're more likely to respond with empathy to people we perceive as similar to us. So often, just getting to know someone better helps kids recognize what they have in common and promotes empathy. Although research says people are more likely to help family members and close friends than strangers, I've noticed that familiarity can breed insensitivity. Too often, kids decide that siblings fall into the empathy exceptions category. Unlike friends who can disappear, siblings know they're not going anywhere, which can make them less motivated to respond in kind ways. Ali Recchia at Concordia University had 7 to 16-year-old children describe times that they had hurt or upset a friend and times that they had hurt or upset a younger sibling. The narratives about the friends emphasized that the harmful behavior was unusual and unintentional. The kids explained that it was really just a misunderstanding, an accident, or the result of extenuating circumstances. The narratives involving younger siblings, on the other hand, emphasized that the harm was typical, deliberate, and provoked. These narratives included cringeworthy statements like, "I was hitting her Barbies across the room with a golf club," or "he was chewing with his mouth open, so I called him a fag." This is so wrong on so many levels. Now, these are not deeply troubled children. They're ordinary kids who justify their behavior by insisting that their siblings deserve meanness. One girl explained, "I called him a stupid, mean, nasty little elf brother. He is pretty short." So how do we deal with children with big empathy blind spots like these? We help them see. In psychology experiments about empathy, researchers usually ask participants directly, "Imagine how you would feel if that happened to you." Parents often say similar things, hoping to encourage some empathy. But my observation is that this tends to make kids feel defensive. They immediately come up with 8 reasons why their actions were justified, and it's not the same as if they were in that situation. What works better with tweens and teens is to open with an excuse. This tells kids that we know they're a good person with good intentions, even when they mess up. Pull your child aside privately and say, "I'm sure you didn't mean to," or "I know you were feeling very frustrated," or "you probably didn't realize." If you provide an excuse, your child doesn't have to come up with one. That makes it more likely that your child will be open to hearing what you have to say. After the excuse, try to describe as vividly as possible what the sibling is feeling. Go for the heartstrings. You could say, "When you said that, it was very upsetting for him because he's having a really hard time with X, and you know how he's been struggling with Y, and it's kind of like what happened to you last year, only worse." After you've painted a poignant picture of the siblings' hurt feelings, then ask for your child's help in addressing them. For younger elementary age or preschool siblings, it may help to do empathy training in the moment of conflict. For example, if a brother and sister are arguing, let them each tell their side of the story while you listen and validate. Nothing constructive is going to happen until they feel heard. Then turn to one child and ask, "How is your brother feeling right now?" Now, most kids will respond to this by insisting, he shouldn't have any feelings because he did this to me. And you can say, I know, I heard you. But right now, we're talking about feelings. Look at his face. What do you see? How is he feeling? And maybe she'll say, he's feeling bad. Good enough. We don't need deep insight here, just basic awareness and acknowledgement. Check with the brother. Is that true? Do you feel bad? And he'll say yes. Then we repeat the question with the other child. And how is your sister feeling right now? The second child is also likely to argue and say that his sister always overreacts. But just stick with it. Encourage him to look at her face and say what he sees. Then check with her to see that the observation is correct. Now comes the really important part. Ask each child in turn, what can you do to help your brother or sister feel better? This is such a wonderful question. It's not quibbling about who did what or who's at fault. It's about encouraging kindness. This brings us to the next general strategy for helping children learn empathy, which is to give them a path forward when they behave in uncaring ways. The automatic response for us adults when we see kids being unkind is to call them on it. You're so mean, you're always doing these mean things, you don't care about anyone. This is not helpful because it implies that the next chapter in the story will involve more meanness. What's more useful is to help children to get back on track with kind behavior. I used to work as a counselor in an elementary school. One day, a first grade teacher, we'll call her Mrs. Smith, called me and said, Dr. Kennedy Moore, you need to come down here right now and get Matthew because he wrote on the desk in pen and then he lied about it, and I will not have lying in my classroom. I could see the steam coming out of her ears, even over the phone. So I brought this future hoodlum back to my office and I said to him, wow, Mrs. Smith sure seems mad. And he said, yeah, but it's okay. I made the problem smaller. And I asked, how did you do that? And he said, I told her I didn't do it. Now, this is typical kid logic. At this age, moral reasoning is all about, will I get in trouble? And the line between what is true and what they wish were true can be a little blurry. So from that point of view, it makes perfect sense to say he didn't do it, because then his teacher wouldn't be mad and it would kind of erase what he did and everything would be good. But I said to Matthew, well, actually, I think that made the problem bigger. Because now Mrs. Smith thinks that you don't care about the desk or keeping the classroom nice for everyone, and I know that isn't true. How did I know this? I didn't. I was guessing. I was guessing that there was at least a part of this boy that wanted to do the right thing. And that's the part we want to speak to when we're trying to help children move past a rough patch, that core goodness within them. So I said to Matthew, what can we do to help Mrs. Smith understand that you really do feel bad about writing on the desk? So we're thinking, and then he says, I could tell her I'm sorry. And I say, great idea. So I grabbed some paper, and because he was a little fellow, I wrote out the words, I'm sorry for writing on the desk, and he copied them. Then I said, oh, that will make Mrs. Smith feel much better. But we still have a problem. There's writing on the desk. What can we do about that? So we're thinking some more, and then he says, I could clean it. And I say, great idea. How would you do that? And it turns out they had paper towels and a spray bottle with a cleaner at the back of the room, so he knew just what to do. So then I said, this is really good. You have your apology note, and you're going to clean the desk. But there's one more problem we need to solve. We need to come up with a plan for what to do when you feel like writing on the desk with pen, but you know you shouldn't. So we're thinking, and then he says, I could write on the desk with marker. I told him, I don't think Mrs. Smith would like that any better than writing on the desk with pen. We can be as leading as we need to be with our problem-solving questions. So I asked him, where do we usually write? And he said, on paper. And I said, great idea. I grabbed some more paper, folded it in half, stapled it together, and wrote Matthew's scribble book on the front. When we went back to his classroom, he looked happy and confident. He handed the note to his teacher, put his scribble book in his desk, and then went to get the cleaning supplies. I would argue that this approach of helping a child think through how to do the right thing is much more effective than making him suffer by taking away recess. I want to talk about one final strategy for helping children develop empathy, which is to help them see themselves as caring people, to embrace empathy as part of their identity. When I was an undergraduate, I read in a psychology textbook about the Kitty Genovese murder. The book explained that Kitty was a young woman who was killed in the courtyard of her apartment building after an extended attack within hearing of more than 30 neighbors who did nothing to help. This was presented as an example of diffusion of responsibility. Everyone assumed that someone else would intervene. Now, the actual facts of this case are a bit different from what the textbook said. Several neighbors did call the police, and one person yelled out the window. And the final part of the attack took place inside, where few people could have seen her. But diffusion of responsibility is a robust finding. Experiments show that about 3/4 of adults will help someone in need when they're alone, but only half will do it if they see other people are present. I remember reading this and promising myself, that will never be me. I will never be the one to say or do nothing when I see someone hurting. It's gotten me into trouble a few times, but I do try to live by that. Placing a strong value on empathy and wanting to be a caring person can motivate people to respond in kind ways. But sometimes circumstances get in the way of kids embracing an identity as a compassionate person. On self-report measures of empathy, girls and women generally score higher than boys and men do. But if we hook people up to machines that measure electrical activity in the brain or physiological responses in the body, there are no sex differences in the biological responses to empathy-inducing stimuli. So males are experiencing affective resonance, but they're not recognizing or admitting to it. One possible explanation for this is that boys may believe that empathy is mushy or girly, and that they need to be tough. A number of authors have written about the culture of cruelty among boys. From both clients in my practice and boys I know personally, I've heard horrifying stories of vicious things that preteen and teenage boys do to each other in locker rooms, bathrooms, and hallways. When they're living in a peer social climate rife with aggression, homophobia, and struggles for dominance, it's not a good idea for boys to wander around being emotionally sensitive and talking about their feelings. So they shut down. And yet, as Dr. Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley points out, compassion is anything but weak. Empathy can inspire heroism, altruism, generosity, and teamwork. Boys are absolutely capable of being empathic without being feminine. If your son has a man in his life who he looks up to, who is both strong and caring, this can help counter messages from the boy culture of cruelty. Because in some sense we are what we do, a good way to foster a compassionate identity in both boys and girls is to give them opportunities to behave in compassionate ways. Doing service activities with friends or family members can help children feel connected to compassion. High school students often complain about the community service hours that many schools require, but research shows that if these programs aren't too heavy-handed, they can inspire kids to become involved and stay involved in volunteer work. Volunteering can also help children become more competent helpers and therefore more willing to help. When our children do compassionate things, we want to acknowledge that. We can say, "Thank you, that was a big help to me." We can help them see the positive impact that they have on others. We can say, "That was very kind of you to play with your little sister. Did you see her face? You made her feel so happy." Or, wow, you worked really hard on cleaning up the stream bed. It looks so much better. Now everyone who walks by can enjoy it. Every day, the news is filled with ugliness, stories of greed, violence, and indifference to suffering. It's easy to give in to hopelessness and cynicism. But Fred Rogers, who starred in the children's television show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, once said, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" Rogers explained that, especially in times of disaster, it's comforting to realize that there are so many caring people out there. In helping our children develop empathy, our hope is that they can come to see themselves among the helpers in the world.